Hey, Dr. John. Recently, a number of our clients have suffered subdural and epidural hematomas. Is this a significant type of a brain injury?
Yes, epidural and subdural hematomas are very significant. And the reason is because they are adjacent to the brain, where all our cognitive functions, our physical functions, and our emotional functions are related. And because if the hematoma is expanding or growing or continues to bleed, that there increases pressure inside the skull that can further damage the brain.
Could you please describe for us the relevant anatomy of the brain so we can understand subdural and epidural hematomas?
To understand the anatomy, let's take a look at this diagram. So what we're looking at here is the side of the brain with the skull removed. What I want you to understand is the brain is made up of what are called sulci and gyri, which are basically the hills and valleys that you can see in this particular diagram. Overlying the brain are three structures called meninges. The first layer is called the pia mater, the second layer is called the arachnoid mater, and the third layer is called the dura mater.
For our clients who suffer subdural and epidural hematomas, could you please describe for us the different functions of those different layers of the brain?
This is a diagram where we can see the outline of the head, and again, we see the side of the brain. We see that the brain has its relationship again with those three different layers. Between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, there's a fluid that's produced called the cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid is responsible for giving protection to the brain as well as nourishing the brain. Between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater, there are other structures as well, which include veins. Those veins can be subject to injury. And then finally, between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater, there's an artery that can also be subject to injury, and that's what can help us understand the epidural and subdural hematomas.
For our clients who have subdural epidural hematomas, could you please help us to understand how the different layers of the brain relate to the development of a subdural epidural hematoma?
Let's take a look at this next diagram. In this diagram, what we're looking at here is a section of the brain along with the skull. And what you can see here is the overlying bone, then the three layers of meninges, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater, and then the underlying brain. This is important to understand because when the blood vessels are injured between these layers, that's what can produce the hematoma. Remember what a hematoma is, it's a collection of blood.
What kind of traumas can cause a subdural epidural brain injury?
Subdural and epidural hematomas, the mechanism of injury can be divided into two broad categories. The first category is direct trauma, or a blow to the head. These can often result in skull fractures. The second type of trauma is an indirect type of trauma, where there's an acceleration, deceleration type of injury, where the brain itself gets hit back and forth inside the skull.
Can a car crash cause a subdural epidural hematoma brain injury?
Car crashes can result in subdural and epidural hematoma injuries because it can also follow the two mechanisms of injury. You can sustain a direct trauma, such as your head hitting against a windshield or somewhere inside the car, or you can sustain a whiplash injury. A whiplash injury is just another name for that acceleration, deceleration type of injury where the brain gets jostled back and forth inside the skull.
Can a fall down victim, somebody who slips and falls or trips and falls, suffer a subdural or epidural hematoma brain injury?
Fall down victims can definitely sustain epidural or subdural hematomas. They can sustain them again through the direct trauma where they hit their head after they fall, or they can sustain them in the acceleration, deceleration type of mechanism where the brain gets jostled around during the impact after the fall.
Can people who are injured on a construction site or by a blow to the head, can they suffer a subdural or epidural brain injury?
Construction sites or a blow to the head can definitely result in subdural or epidural hematomas. Construction sites, especially with a heavy type of material falling on your head, often can result in skull fractures, and then they're associated with the epidural hematomas. An assault also can result in either acceleration or deceleration type of injuries, and those can also result in the subdural hematomas.
What kind of symptoms can our clients expect to experience when they've suffered a subdural or epidural hematoma brain injury?
The type of symptoms relate to where the hematoma or the collection of blood has occurred. Usually you will develop symptoms that are very similar to what people call a concussion. You can get headaches, dizziness, some people get amnesia or vomiting. But again, these are variable and you should seek attention if you've struck your head in that way.
What type of treatment or specialist should our clients seek out when they suffer a subdural or epidural hematoma injury?
Epidural and subdural hematomas need to be evaluated and treatment typically by a neurosurgeon. If the surgical intervention is required, the neurosurgeon would be the qualified provider to perform this type of surgery.
For our clients who suffer subdural or epidural hematoma brain injuries, what can they reasonably expect in the future? What kind of future complications might they have?
Future expectations after a subdural or epidural hematoma are dependent on the size and the location of that hematoma. The larger the size, the more substantial the expectation for future problems. Smaller hematomas, or ones that get absorbed, typically don't have much later consequences.
Thanks, Dr. John.
You're welcome, Mark.